Hello again. I'm back from my voyages to Turkey and back in my basement. Hopefully, no spiders this time. So, we are going to talk about how I've tried to create a framework for speaking about complexity and analyzing urban complex systems using the framework initially developed by Kevin Lynch. Now, I should probably preface this by saying that this may not be for you the most useful framework, which is an odd way to start a lecture. Maybe I should start it by saying this could be a very useful framework, but then again, it may not be. I felt that when people are trying to come to terms with complexity, it's a hard entry point, and so I wanted to figure out whether there was an entry point into complexity that was maybe more intuitive for urban designers. And I chose Kevin Lynch's work because his work is dominates so much in urban discourse in any event. So I want to share this framework with you. It was developed as part of my PhD. And it may help you to start to think about how you could analyze other systems, although this was developed most specifically for the urban environment. All right, so Kevin Lynch wrote probably one of the top 5 most influential books in urban design, Image of the City. I would say that other than the work of Jane Jacobs, this is probably the most dominating text that you would see if you sort of Google top 5 urban design texts. And so it's been immensely, immensely important for us as a profession. And yet there's kind of something odd about how he frames what makes a good city. And Lynch wanted to say that we can learn about what makes good cities by understanding their imageability. So I'm just going to start with this quote by an urban analyst, Cuthbert. He writes, with few exceptions, traditional definitions of urban design constitute descriptions of perceptible surface structures in administrative, professional, aesthetic, or other arrangements. A bit like trying to define gravitation in terms of apples falling to the ground by what color the apples are, what type of apple, how they compare to apples falling off other trees, in the absence of a supporting hypothesis. So what Cuthbert is trying to say here is that why are we looking at the surface qualities of urban design and saying what makes something good, right? And defining it in terms of its surface qualities, rather than trying to talk about what actually is kind of the underlying forces that lead to that surface appearance. So again, this idea of thinking less about the object and more about the driving processes or driving relationships. Now, Kevin Lynch's work is work that we tend to look at from this surface perspective. And I've got to kind of maybe take a step back and talk a little bit about how Kevin Lynch's work has been popularized in practice versus what his intentions were for it. So Lynch himself really wasn't so interested in like these surface ideas. And I think you all know Lynch: landmarks, edges, nodes, districts, gateways, right? No, not gateways, pathways. That's a bad error. I think that was a test question on 371. So Lynch talked about those categories as ways we cognitively understand the city. But there are different ways in which we can understand what he meant. We can think of these as the imageable features. If we have a landmark, that's obviously an imageable feature. But is the feature something that then produces good city dynamics? Or is the feature something that emerges because of good city dynamics? Are we putting the cart before the horse? My research is trying to reclaim Lynch's categories to encompass these more performative qualities of space. And Lynch himself was more interested in this. But what has happened subsequent to Kevin Lynch is that it's so easy to talk about a landmark or a street edge as a thing that urban designers think that if they just can get the landmarks right and the edges right and the districts right, then maybe they will create good urban form. And in particular, I guess I was very moved in this research by the popularity of new urbanism, because new urbanism is one of the few sort of practices that is really having an impact on how cities are being shaped today. And they are very much trying to codify what makes good urban form by looking at a lot of these, what I would say are more surface features. So my work is trying to reclaim some of Lynch's categories in a way where we can talk about how they perform as opposed to what they look like. All right, so new urbanism strategies have become increasingly prominent in North America. They employ an object-centered approach to planning that can be considered Lynchian in its use of spatial archetypes. And when I say Lynchian, what I mean is that it's not necessarily what Lynch intended, but it's how his work has been appropriated. It is a normative approach that focuses on visual attributes of urban form. Nonetheless, it's very popular. While new urbanism attempts to impose the image of a good city based on precedents, what I'm suggesting is that they need to attune more to the dynamics, not to the image of the places that they wish to emulate. So they're very good at studying precedents and saying, we live in cities that a lot of people don't like. Can't we look at historic precedents and try to figure out how we can make places more like these beautiful places that we visit and we see these are wonderful? The question is, what are they taking from those precedents? And I would say they're taking the surface rather than the process. They're taking the individual objects as opposed to trying to understand the relationships that underlie those objects. Okay, so here's the framework. Here's Lynch's categories: landmarks, paths, district, nodes, and edges. Those are the 5. I've added a 6th, which is cells. And what's interesting in this 6th one is that Lynch actually also does talk about cells as another kind of urban element. It's just it wasn't popularized in his group of 5 that everyone talks about when they're doing urban analysis. And just as a reminder, landmarks, things like towers, paths, obviously the street network, districts, those sort of clusters. Nodes are gathering places, so like open plazas, and edges are kind of the boundary conditions that could be established, like a river corridor or a rail corridor. What's interesting about edges is that often people don't understand that that's really intended to be a boundary condition. So they'll look at edges sometimes as the surface conditions of, say, a street facade. And that actually winds up being useful for me in terms of how I look at edges or how I reappropriate edges. Cells is really about what is the urban tissue. So think about how the urban tissue of Amsterdam, the fabric that makes up that tissue, is of a particular kind of granular nature. We can think of that as its cell. If we look at North American cities in suburban developments, it's a very different kind of urban tissue, a very different kind of cellular fabric at a different scale. And so we want to focus on what is the nature not only of these 5 classic areas, but also of these cells. So here we can compare. Can we co-opt Lynch's very intuitive categories that people are familiar with working with in order to discuss complexity, which people aren't used to talking about? If we were to do that, then we would see the urban tissue, the kind of the grain of built fabric, the operable grain of built fabric, as being the agents in the system. And you can think, well, the Grand Bazaar has got a particular grain to it as well that's different from the grain of North American shopping mall or something. A mall, big box malls, have got a very, very different kind of grain or cellular structure to them. And obviously a big box store, for that to transform, that's not a very light, quick, cheap thing to do, whereas the tiny, tiny grain of the Grand Bazaar cell is a very different kind of agent within that system. Both are agents, but one has much more difficulty in undergoing a transformation. Paths are what carry resources. And in my instance, I'm going to take edges and agree with the misinterpretation that people have, where they tend to think about this as what are the surface qualities, and say these are those stigmergic surfaces, which here I've called tags, but they're also sort of the things that can carry stigmergy or signals. Landmarks and nodes then become both the hubs and connectors within the system, and districts are the emergent clusters. So this is just the framework that I showed you at the end of the last section. And you can take a look at this and read through it more carefully if you pause the video. But basically in the Grand Bazaar, we had cells, and that being like the typical grain of urban fabric, which could be shops or homes, paths, street networks, hubs and landmarks. Hubs are the landmarks and nodes, which could be gathering places, public plazas, churches, schools, squares, etc. And the edges are the urban surfaces, the public-private interface, which are the street fronts, the displays, the hard or soft surfaces that maybe can convey signaling in some way. Districts then are the complementary use zones or clustered use areas, such as antique districts, gallery precincts, etc. We understand, we've talked about their functional role of each of these things in a complex adaptive system in terms of agents learning, in terms of networks organizing flows, in terms of areas where you want to have synergies developed, in terms of how you want to send signals, and in terms of how you want to have aggregations of co-evolved agents. And maybe I haven't spoken enough about why this aggregation of co-evolving agents, like what is better about, say you have, I don't know, 3 restaurants in a town of 300 people. Are you better off putting the 3 restaurants separate so that they are equidistant from 100 people each? Or are you better off bringing them all together so that they're close to one another? And intuitively, you might think you're better off distributing them spatially. But actually, when you bring the restaurants together, they gain from each other. There's an economics of gain whereby if one restaurant is full, then it can spill over to the next restaurant. And if you come for one restaurant and you learn that another one is actually better, or you decide to check out a different restaurant, you're better off for all the businesses gain rather than if they were to simply operate separately, because then their catchment is really limited to just the people in their catchment area, where they can expand their catchment area by clustering together, and they get a bigger kind of resource pool to draw from. And then it also helps them to specialize because they can tweak their resources. They can say, oh, that guy's doing better than I'm doing. How do I change? And maybe I can digress a little bit and speak about an example of this in terms of signaling in my hometown of Winnipeg. So there is one area called Cordon, and Cordon is also known as Little Italy. So for whatever reason, because of whatever contingent historic processes, one pizzeria opened up and then another pizzeria, and then we have all of these Italian pasta stores, and they all opened up within the space of about 3 city blocks. And in the summertime, people walking up and down these streets, and they go to these Italian restaurants, Little Italy. So that's an emergent cluster. Now, what happened was that sometime, I guess it would be about 20 years ago now, one of the Italian restaurants, I guess the family, maybe the parents got older and the kids didn't want to take over the Italian business. You know how these things go. Anyway, the business got sold, someone else opened it, and guess what? A sushi place opened up in Little Italy. Now, we can see this as being a new potential niche. Like, is there a carrying capacity for sushi in Little Italy? And it turns out there was. It was really successful. That business got really, really populated and made a good go of it. It wasn't like people said, sushi in Little Italy, not interested. No, people were excited about it. Now let's think about 2 different kinds of urban fabrics in terms of signaling. So imagine that all of these restaurant businesses are have their diners sitting completely 100% indoors. And so you can't see which restaurants are full or empty. If you're a restaurant owner, you can't really see which restaurants are doing well and which aren't. Then, if your business isn't doing well, then you're sort of blind to any signals about what maybe you could do better. But Cordon was interesting because Cordon had sidewalk patios everywhere. And so if a business opened and did poorly, no one would be sitting in the patio. But if a business opened and did well, everyone would be sitting in that patio. And so very quickly, business owners could stand outside their shop, just like in the Grand Bazaar, and look up and down the street and observe which patios were still rolling late into the night, lots of happy people. And it turned out sushi was. And over the course of 10 years, one by one by one by one, the neighborhood transformed until it was almost all sushi restaurants. That is an example of bottom-up self-organization, emerging systems brought about by having these signals in the environment that people can respond to and learn from, and the niche can, the agents can evolve, in this case the agents being the individual restaurant businesses, based on a new fitness landscape that says, you know, the young people today, they're just not that interested in going for Italian. They want sushi. So, so I hope this sort of makes sense for you, as well as to why the signaling is important, why the clustering is important. Because if you are not part of that group, if you're the one Italian restaurant that's off sitting on its own, and your business is kind of meh, you're not getting that signal of what you could potentially be doing differently. But if you're clustered with all the other businesses, then you're seeing what's transforming. You're seeing how the fitness landscape is evolving. And then in addition to this, we can go to the ecosystem examples of how this plays out in ecology. You know, in ecology, the cells would be the different species, paths would be the channels of energy sources that are flowing through an environment. You know, there's differentials in terms of sun paths, there's differentials in terms of nutrients, and in terms of trails, in terms of streams. All these resources are flowing differentially, and you're part of a network where you're trying to tap into those resources. Hubs and landmarks are congregation sites where flows can converge, areas with high densities of resources. And so those become kind of basins of attraction, right? If you have an ecosystem where there's, you know, one pond where more things can be happening, then that's where the species will tend to converge. Edges become the signals that broadcast information to other species, and those could be pheromone trails, those could be bird calls, those could be plumage displays. All these kinds of things are sort of providing information about how the system can shift. And finally, we have districts, which are patches of species inhabiting a particular niche, such as schools of fish or flocks of birds. So I started off this slide by saying I wasn't going to read through the slide, and then of course I read through the entire slide, but that's okay. You can go back, you can take a look at it still. All right, so resource flows, let's take these one by one. These are functional pathways that encounter minimum friction and that facilitate resource exchange. They emerge through the dynamics of agent interactions, and the thicknesses derive from overlays of flows operating at different scales. Redundancy leads to multiple opportunities for interactions and new connections. And those functional pathways, I mean, maybe it's easy for you to think about them in terms of the World Wide Web and how you navigate and how you're flowing around the internet. And, you know, you're going to have overlaying paths where you have different kind of clusters of websites that tend to interlink to one another and reinforce each other, and you have thicker pathways. You know, you gravitate towards certain sites, but also because you're being linked to them. This lecture is being linked to a YouTube channel, right? And so what are the multiplicities of flows, and how are those redundant so you can move around the network in different ways? And you want to be able to do that in a very free way. So these resource flows, when we think about them in complex systems, what does that represent? A pathway. And so here's ants forming a pathway. So in a complex system, the ant's pathway isn't directing the ant's search for food. The pathway, and let me clarify what I mean by that. If you were to force a bunch of ants to go along a certain line, the ants could walk that pathway, but the pathway would be meaningless unless there was food at the end of it. So the pathway is a structure that emerges, that is derived from the ant's search for food. When the ant finds food, it leaves a pheromone trace, and then the path is formed because of that pheromone trace. But the pheromone trace isn't random. It's based on the fact that there is an actual resource that the ant wants at the end of that pathway. So in new urbanist processes, what they'll do is they'll compose a pathway. They'll say, good cities have beautiful pathways. Let's design a beautiful pathway. But here now, we're now trying from the top down to control where the pathway is, rather than saying, where should that pathway be? Where should it emerge? Again, another example from Winnipeg, from urban design, that I found to be really such a lost opportunity, was that so there's a mall in downtown Winnipeg that runs parallel to the main street. There had been kind of ratty shops along the main street. They ripped them down and they built this long mall, and then they built some housing behind it. And they said, okay, well, we should have like, they'd seen images of like beautiful cobblestone pathways with garage doors opening onto shops. So they said, let's make a linear path behind the mall, and we'll have these garage doors open out onto the pathway, and it'll be this little vibrant street that we make. Great. Looks wonderful. Looks great in the drawings, and there's happy people in the drawings. They're walking around. There's people sitting in the cafes, and then they built it that way. And then you go on to this cobblestone street with beautiful infrastructure and lovely lighting and these gorgeous garage doors, and nobody walking. Darn designers. What's missing? Well, the pathway went from precisely nowhere to precisely nowhere, from point 0 to point 0, not from point A to point B. The pathway had no reason to be there. So they thought, okay, if we build the pathway, they will come. But there was no reason for a pathway to be there. In fact, what they wound up doing is now you had 3 or 4 or 5 redundant pathways, because you had the sidewalk on the main busy street that the mall faced onto. That was one pathway. You had the pathway in parallel to that. You had a second pathway running inside the mall, so taking traffic off the front street. But of course, the mall was also 3 stories, so triple that 3 times up as pathway. And then you inserted a 5th pathway behind the building in this cobblestone zone at the rear end, with, again, no reason to be moving along it. Why I say it hurt me every time I would walk along there is because the office that I worked at was actually, if the mall ran this way, I had to walk this way towards my office. And so the pathway was this way, and there was another route that was sort of treated a bit like a back lane, but the bus stopped right near there. And then there was a beautiful park just beyond it, and there was all this housing around the park. So there was a beautiful destination, lots of population, and all that population had to come through the mall and get to the bus stop, because a lot of the people living in that area in the inner city use the bus more than having personal vehicles. So this route that ran from the bus stop to the area where I worked had tons of people walking along it, but no garage doors, no cafes, nothing. And then right adjacent to it, where no one was walking, was all this beautiful infrastructure. So this is what I mean when I say we have to first understand how is the resource flowing, and then make the pathways based on that. When we do it the reverse way, it's nonsensical. And how can we begin to think about pathways more about where is the resource flowing, as opposed to what does it look like? How does it compose? Okay, network hubs. So these are kind of enslaving structures that kind of hold things together. They can be both global and local within a network, and they represent attractor states of urban flows, peaks in the fitness landscape that emerge through path-dependent processes. So when you begin to have different kind of networks that converge, you get these nodes, that kind of idea of the rich get richer, and there can be a global node for the whole network, or there can be more local nodes distributed throughout. So what does this mean? Okay, so landmarks and nodes are network hubs. So in a fitness landscape, we would hope that we want to be attracted to these nodes, right? These are different fitness peaks within this dynamic fitness landscape. You can also think about it in terms of these are airport hubs, right? And so these become nodes within a network. They become the attractor states. As this node becomes more popular, I don't know if this is Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, maybe, then that, because it's a hub, more air traffic tends to come there, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see that the landmarks and the nodes are emerging here because of the dynamics of the system that cause them to be created. In that way, landmarks and nodes should be physical manifestations of intrinsic processes rather than operating as extrinsic or applied formal gestures. So maybe I can give you another example of this. Like a natural node in a city would be a railway station in the center, particularly in European cities where a lot of people travel by rail. Maybe not so much so in North American cities, but in Europe, the rail station is a real hub. And so people will naturally gravitate towards there because there's a reason to go there, because it's actually an attractor and it forms a connection point within a network. Similarly at church, it's a natural gravitation point because people go to church. So the fact that we have these beautiful landmarks in European cities that look like church towers or look like railway towers or something, that look coincides with an important meeting junction point within the landscape. And these are these junction points where connections happen, either connections between people or goods or flows or resources of some sort moving through the network. In New Urbanism, here you have, this is a New Urbanism project, and they have a tower over here. And so it looks like it's a landmark, but the tower is, if you zoom into the image, it's sort of just got blocked off windows. Like it's actually nothing. It's just this thing on the corner. So we're building the look of a landmark, but we're not trying to understand the dynamics that would generate an actual functional landmark within the site. There's nothing functionally that makes this actually work. I think that when I was looking at this, I think I looked at this through Google Images. It was a few years ago that was actually vacant on the lower level, like an empty shop, announcing itself as a landmark. Similarly, this is another New Urbanist project, and they've built this some sort of open plaza. So this would be a node in Kevin Lynch's understanding. But there was nothing to feed this node. Like they made this big plaza. Now in Europe, if it was a big plaza, there would be cafes, restaurants, shops all around it. But there wasn't anything like that to actually support this as a node, nor was it actually passing through a movement, or sorry, nor was it the intersection of movement routes that is collecting people from different directions. So you can't just emulate the form of these things without trying to understand the underlying dynamics. Next, we have information tags, and we've talked about these in complexity as these are signaling something, competencies. They can direct behavior, like pheromones are an information tag, direct ants to food. And some urban surfaces have the capacity to act as a medium that carries these signals or the memory of behaviors and then can guide subsequent behaviors, and others do not. So we talked about the idea that different kinds of urban surfaces can carry information in different ways. Here we have kind of information overload. Here we have, no information. This is the example of, a business owner standing out on the street here isn't learning anything, whereas this guy is this information-rich environment, can absorb a lot within the space. Now, the shop can't process the information without the guy standing here. But the guy standing here can't make use of that information unless the shop itself affords him changing it into something else. So this is where there's this imbrication of agency, or this entanglement of agency, where this guy's no good without the shop that's small and flexible, and the shop's no good without the guy to take on the information. And the shop can assist in the information signaling by being a surface that actually relays information. So those are the ways in which we sort of, the shop doesn't magically transform itself without any evolution, without any human agency. We can't speak about it evolving in that way, but we can speak about how evolution is enabled. And the reason why I put this one, information poor, information blur, information decor, I was trying to kind of make them rhyme because I like that. Rich doesn't rhyme, so whatever. But this is decor simply because, as I said, there is no relationship between the signal of this curved building and it being anything special within that network. So you're basically getting just a decorative idea. Sometimes new urbanists will place benches along the sidewalk in places where it's totally clear you would never sit on the bench, like it's just a completely awkward position. So it just feels like they're decorating it with things that are nice urban features as opposed to actually understanding the dynamics. And I shouldn't bash new urbanists, because in a way, I think new urbanists really, really have the right intentions at heart. They want to make more livable, humane cities. And in that sense, I totally am behind the perspective. I just think that they're missing this critical part by focusing on form rather than focusing on process. So I feel they've really erred that way. And then in terms of emergence, emergent clusters are the result of internal functional dynamics. They arise, emergent features arise from the bottom up. And as the environment takes on physical characteristic, it then enslaves subsequent actions in a path-dependent process. And all I mean by that is, again, the carrying capacity of the Grand Bazaar might be, I don't know, 400 jewelry stores, right? And the way in which those jewelry stores organize and form an emergent cluster, the precise look of that cluster, that is contingent based on historical processes, which other businesses went out of business that they could move into. You know, where were the flows more dominant at a given time? Those are contingent pieces. But the idea that then, you know, you can get an emergent district, that is something that plays out regardless of the scenario. It's almost like the bazaar. You can think of it as it is running its own computation. It is a computational model that's enacted on the ground based on certain rules. And as it's processing the information, it keeps adapting and morphing and shifting in response to the input rules that it's getting. Input rules being as simple as going out of business, must try something else. Look around, seek other good business choices. If so, do more like them. If no information, roll dice, try something else, right? Okay, so again, with districts, intrinsic versus extrinsic form, this is a termite mound, and you can see it's got like a structure, but this structure is not coming from any master plan. It's a very complex structure, and it's a very functional structure, and you can see it's quite differentiated. There's specialized areas here. There's different kinds of networks within it. But this is not coming from a master plan. It's coming from these signals that are generated from the bottom up. And in contrast, we have a new urbanism plan, and it also has these structures, but they're much more about a top-down composition than about trying to understand these dynamics. Now, Lynch, I think, would be very happy with the way in which I'm trying to sort of rework or reclaim his categories, because he himself says the valued city is not an ordered one, but one that can be ordered, a complexity whose pattern unfolds. And this is a quote from The Image of the City Revisited. Okay, so parting thoughts. And these, I'm leaving you with the words of Rem Koolhaas, because maybe Kevin Lynch doesn't seem as interesting as someone really cool like Rem Koolhaas. I hope Rem Koolhaas is still cool. He's pretty cool to me. He writes, if there is to be a new urbanism, it will not be based on the twin fantasies of order and omnipotence. And by that, we mean sort of that top-down royal science static control. It will be the staging of uncertainty. It will no longer be concerned with the arrangement of more or less permanent objects, but with the irrigation of territories with potential. It will no longer aim for stable configurations, but for the creation of enabling fields that accommodate processes that refuse to be crystallized into definitive form. Thank you so much for your attention. Looking forward to next time.